Okay. Okay, thank you, Andrea, and a big welcome to Greg Lambrecht from Coravin. We're really grateful to have you here, Greg, and even more equally grateful that you gave the thumbs up to give us a wonderful 20% benefit for our members for both the systems and the accessories. And I'm hoping lots of members will be inspired after today's Let's Talk About to buy more or buy a new Coravin system. Just to share with everyone a little bit about Greg's background. Greg is, of course, the inventor and the founder of Coravin, and he remains a board member. What he had really achieved was to link his passion for wine with his engineering degrees from MIT and a career in medical technologies to innovate in this wine tech sector to create Coravin, a wine preservation system that uses a non-pouring needle pass through the cork while it's still in the bottle. Many of you will have used one and seen that in action. Since that first device that Greg invented, he and the team have continued to innovate and launched a bunch of additional products for still and more recently for sparkling wine. And they're used by consumers and trade professionals alike, giving them the freedom to pour any wine in any amount if you don't want to finish the bottle, and not wasting anything. Greg is also the founder and executive director of Intrinsic Therapeutics Incorporation, a venture-backed medical device company focused on addressing the needs of patients with spinal disorders. So Greg's going to talk about all sorts of factors impacting wine preservation, very much the tech side. Questions will be welcomed at the end. And I think you've all read everything else he's going to talk about. So I'm going to hand over to Greg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wink, and thank you everybody for coming to this. I am a wine drinker, not a wine professional. I'm also not a wine writer, so I feel intimidated and pleased, very, very pleased, because I love to read about wine. I am a wine reader, and I'm also a nerd. I'm a physicist and an engineer. I work in medicine half the time. I work in Coravin half the time. So I split my life 50-50, and that's literally 100% of my day outside of sleep. So I'm deeply passionate about wine, and I've spent 23 years working on Coravin, various prototypes. I have some special wines here with me today that I'll access into, and my very first prototype here as well. So I'll share a little bit of that. But I wanted to go into the full science of wine preservation beyond just Coravin, and to explore a little bit its history. There's a lot of reference articles I'm happy to share afterwards if anybody is interested in any of these things that were the primary research. And I'm also happy to answer questions along the way. I have here with me some of my first test bottles, and I'll speak to those when we get to another portion of the presentation. So I have a PowerPoint that sort of walks through what I learned. So as a wine consumer and as a wine collector, I was interested in wine preservation, how I could extend the life of an open bottle wine, and more importantly, how I could gain access to multiple different wines on a Tuesday without having to think about when I was going to drink from them again. And certainly there's the aspect of preserving wine once you start consuming it, but there's a lot more that goes into it than that. And so I had fun exploring this topic to build this presentation. Whoops. See if I can get this to run. Always tricky. Here we go. Especially run. There's this. Oh, look at that! It's not going to let me. There we go. So turns out there's lots of things, as you guys know, that can accelerate the aging or change wine in a way that's not beneficial. It's not just exposure to oxygen, although oxygen is an important part. Anything that accelerates a chemical reaction, light, heat, vibration, are the common ones. can accelerate the aging of a wine and cause negative changes for sure. And I'm going to step through some of that. So it's not just the pouring. So when I did my research, I looked into how it was made, what it was in, the filling process, the sealing process, the shipping, storing, serving, and then of course sparkling wines. And the great thing about wine is that it is 8,000 plus years old, and so there's a good history of people trying to consume it at its freshest. So when I looked into the factors that were involved in winemaking, the obvious one early on was just letting it oxidize. And so there are some lovely, as you know, oxidative wines, and more exposure to oxygen means that the exposure to additional oxygen has less of an impact overall on the flavor. But fortification was a really important addition to the longevity of wine. And as you know, the story of the first bottling of wine in cork and glass, it was a British fellow who was a bottle manufacturer, and it was bottling of ports and sherries in the 17th century. But this addition of alcohol acts as a preservative, interrupting the distillation or the fermentation process, but also protecting the wine, certainly on its warm voyages and long warm voyages from Porto and elsewhere to London. Sulfur was an interesting one. So sulfur reacts with oxygen and therefore scavenges it before the wine is damaged. Sulfur's actually been added, maybe not intentionally, to wine for a very long period of time. It was remarkable to find that the Romans used sulfur-burning compounds, so they would burn compounds, have the amphora upside down, so that the smoke from these burning compounds would rise up into the amphora. And we found these sulfur compounds lining old Roman amphora, so figured out exactly what they were doing. And it was a great idea because sulfur really is very effective at grabbing oxygen. It came into widespread use in the early 1900s. So there are some factors in the winemaking process. There's also microoxygenation, which may help to protect it. There's attempts to prevent oxygen from contacting the wine at all. So there's filling up the barrel again to try to decrease the headspace. All sorts of different things that you can do during the winemaking process that either do or do not introduce oxygen into the system. The next question is what is it in? Not only what is it in from a long-term storage standpoint, bottling, for example, but during the fermentation and shipping process. So we have found, as you guys know, ceramic laced with grape residue going back to 6000 BC in Georgia. I haven't picked a side on the Iran versus Georgia argument about how far back wine is made, but either one of them deserves a whole lot of credit for what they did. And the amphora was the primary form of storage and shipping for a considerable amount of time. It's much more long history, or a longer history than cork and glass. Let's see if I got this. The 2nd century, the Romans, and they're the next two, had very good records of storage and movement of wine in barrel. So the Romans actually developed oak barrels for shipping, and I like this picture of this intrepid sailor with no leg room, sort of like a British Airways flight from Boston to London. But he's got barrels of wine in front of him, so at least he was happy. Back in the 2nd century AD, there's that marvelous bottle of wine in the German museum, and I'm relatively certain that is wine amongst that slurry in the glass bottle. But it's remarkable how close the Romans got to our modern storage of wine for long periods of time. They had cork flooring, they understood what cork was, but they tended to seal either their amphora or this glass container with olive oil or olive oil soaked rags, or olive oil soaked rags wrapped around a wooden cap, or simply just covering it with more clay or trying to close it with ceramic. So they didn't quite get to the idea of cork and glass, but you can see with the oil and rag strategy, some wine has been able to survive actually for thousands of years, which is really striking. I have suggested Coravining this bottle. Nobody has said yes. to my request. I don't know that I would be the first to taste it. So then the argument about cork and glass, and it came up with this really spectacular idea that altered the trade of wine and the long-term preservation of wine, the aging of wine. Came about in the 1600s. I've been to Berry Brothers and Rudd and seen some of these original bottles. There's the argument about Dom Perignon and his use of cork and glass. There's very good records, though, of a British fellow whose name is escaping me right now. Somebody knows it, who was a bottle manufacturer and a bottler. And so he has great records of using cork and glass to preserve wine. Cork is an absolutely remarkable material. It is one of the most, if not the most, elastic solid above the surface of the ocean. You can compress it 90% and it'll come back to 98% of its original volume, as you've seen with some champagne corks. It really is a remarkable thing, and it's relatively impervious to the transmission of oxygen. Perfectly formed cork does an extraordinary job of sealing a bottle. So this is really when things changed dramatically for the better and enabled long-term storage. Canned wine, 1935 US canned wine. And it was, they struggle with it even now, that you have to get the right liner and not all wines work. So you can see they started with fortification, fortified wine in can back in 1935 in the US. And it's gone through a significant evolution since then. And we're seeing more and more canned wine here in the United States. Go ahead. Sorry. We've actually seen, I've seen a market report just recently that canned wine growth, 3,000% growth year on year, over the pandemic, which is pretty striking. So I think that we're going to see more from canned wine. It is challenging to get long-term storage out of canned wine just because of the way cans are made. They laser cut or stamp the cuts in the top of the bottle or the can to allow it to be opened easily. And that allows some oxygen permeation, and interaction between the wine and the liner can be negative for certain wines. Bag and box, great idea. Single serve wine in a box. I was over at my son's place yesterday and he had at least one bag and box despite his ownership of Coravin. And it was developed by a guy named Thomas Angove in Australia. Oh, there we go. I couldn't see the name of the wine guy bottle because your faces were covered. So Thomas Angove developed the bag and box in the 60s. Mylar liner can work very, very well. Oxygen doesn't get in during pouring, and Mylar is pretty effective at storage. I believe a NASA innovation. We are seeing some PET bottles for wine storage and preservation. They're light is their advantage. They don't break. Another advantage, and they're relatively oxygen impermeable. So there is some potential use of this in long-term wine storage in terms of carbon footprint. I'm not a big fan of plastic in some mass-produced products, so just because of the recycling, it's challenging. But they are there, and I did see some very cool innovations in the UK. Frugal Pack is probably in the lead of even using recycled paper to help store wine. So I'm a fan of Jancis Robinson's. I really like her push to embarrass wineries that use really thick, heavy glasses. Because something like 40% or 50% of the carbon footprint of wine is in the glass bottle. It's fabrication and shipping, and the higher the weight, the worse it is. So these bottles have an opportunity to displace, at least to some extent. And there's also some light glass that has been developed of late to decrease carbon footprint. It's been a great evolution, and now you can get, certainly with cork and glass, very, very long-term storage. I've had wines from the 1800s and 1700s that were effectively sealed. So how it's filled, this is where I ran into nitrogen and argon and carbon dioxide as original gases to test, to see what was the best thing to store wine or displace wine using Coravin. Turns out when you're moving wine around in a winery, they can use a technique of sparging, where they bubble nitrogen or carbon dioxide through, and it'll tend to minimize the oxygen contact as the wine is flowing. And there's also clearing of bottles on the bottling line using an inert gas just before they fill to make sure that there's no air inside the container before it touches the wine. Very effective. This is where we start getting into my favorite topic. How is wine sealed? So corks. A cork is not a cork is not a cork. There's lots of different types of cork. There's natural corks, fully natural corks. There's agglomerated corks that may be just compressed or compressed with glues. There's capped composite corks, all the different technical corks that are out there, trying to decrease the cost of the closure as well as hopefully reduce the risk of cork taint. They've all been tested. There's Stelvin, developed by the French in the 1950s for liquor closures originally. Stelvin liners can come, or wine liners can come in a bunch of different ways. The operative wine-facing material that's really important is either saran wrap, Saranex, polyvinyl dichloride. Turns out that saran wrap is one of the most oxygen impermeable things that we have found as a polymer. And so it's normally a stacked composite or a sandwich, and that liner is what's facing the wine, is actually doing the oxygen ingress prevention. And then there's the original tin saran liner. So you'll see a metallized liner on the inside. You'll either see white, which is the polyethylene foam through the liner, or you'll see silver, and both have been used very effectively since the 1950s to close wine. More recently, there's Vinalock glass, and you look at that and you think, how's glass sealing against glass, and how do you get that open? It's actually a polymer called EVA, ethyl vinyl alcohol, that is the sort of a translucent polymer that is sitting at the bottom of the head of that cap, that is interfacing between the glass cork or stopper and the glass liner or the glass of the bottle. And that's what's really doing your sealing. Heinrich in Austria uses a lot of Vinalock, and it's under foil, and he's responsible for breaking more Coravin needles than any other winemaker on the planet, as people try to Coravin through a glass stopper, which does not work. So I like the science part, and so found an article. I think this is from the Australian Wine Research Institute, but I can pull up the reference later. And it looks at comparing all these different closures and their oxygen transmission rate. So OTR, it's a commonly used term, even we use it here at Coravin, in cc's of oxygen per day. And so when you can see the scale is pretty low, 0.0007 or 0.007. And if you look at them, though, the more oxygen permeable on the left and the less oxygen permeable on the right, and you can see that the screw caps win. Hence the incredible reductive nature you can find even in some older stored screw cap wines. I'm sure you've had the pleasure of trying them. As a result, one of the smartest things I heard was from the fellow who runs Schloss Gobelsberg. He said, you make the wine to the closure. It is a mistake to make the same wine and put it under cork and put it under screw cap, because the wine under screw cap does not need as much sulfur. It does not need to scavenge oxygen as much. And so he said that one of his great lessons was paying attention to OTR and being of the closure technique and being careful to make the wine specifically to the closure. Some of the corks, the alternative cork, I believe that alternative cork about 6 from the right, 5 or 6 from the right, is Diam. Diam has a bunch of different oxygen transmission rates depending upon the quality of the Diam that you get. And then you can see that they tested across natural cork, which can be pretty highly variable, agglomerated cork, which can be pretty highly variable too. Synthetic corks have no variability, right, because they're plastic. So they tend to be at least consistent, if that's what you're looking for. So how it's shipped, there is a fellow here in Boston named Eric Vocht, and he started a company called eProvenance, which put a temperature sensor GPS tracker into cases, and convinced wineries to put this temperature sensing GPS tracker into their cases, because his concern was, while it was wonderful at the winery, it's not always wonderful at home. And what the heck is happening? And so, there was a poor shipment of Penfolds that got caught up in a political fight between China and Australia, and it sat on a boat in a dock in the summer in China for a long period of time. So heat exposure can certainly cause damage, and then trucking, if it's not refrigerated, can cause damage. And he asked the question, what percentages of wine are being damaged during the shipping process? So the winery can do whatever it likes. The storage can be as good as it is. But apparently, if you're shipping from France to China, 75%-ish of the wine is overexposed to heat. So he looked at shipments from France to the UK, to Japan, and to China, and showed that China was getting really warmed wine. And in fact, I ran into a wine rating organization in China that refused to taste at the winery. They only tasted when purchased off the shelf in China to really rate that wine as it is going to be experienced by their customers. And it seems like they've got good reason. The other thing that they did was they looked at wines that were shipped from Napa to Bordeaux, or from Bordeaux or from Burgundy, to see if any one region was more damaged. And it seems like we in California have some work to do to decrease the overexposure to heat from our wines. So that's critical. How wine is stored also has an impact, as you know. I found a great article that looked at exactly this. Sorry, I'm in our kitchen at the office, so we're active today. So this article basically looked at all of the characteristics that were controlled by, that could be impacted by temperature, and they put it at a baseline of 10 degrees C, and then they tested from there. So they went down to 5 degrees, and they went up to 30, 35 degrees. And what they basically said was, when you get to 20 degrees C, you really start to have a very significant impact on the browning, oxidation, and the decline in sulfur. So the chemical reactions are accelerated pretty steeply after 20 degrees C. And in fact, Eric Vogt used 20 degrees C as his dividing line. And those are accelerations in chemical reaction. You can see it's nonlinear. It was maybe a year after the launch of Coravin, and I was called by a guy who lived 100 yards from me, who had purchased a Coravin, and he invited me over, and he took me downstairs to his cellar, and he said, "Oh, prepare yourself." He has jackets on the outside of his cellar. I keep my cellar at 2 degrees centigrade. And he had a collection of 1982 Bordeaux, this massive collection of 82 Bordeaux in the cellar at 2 degrees centigrade. And so we grabbed a couple of bottles, brought them upstairs. They were unaged. Is drinking young Bordeaux. So you can slow it down as well. Vibration is also bad. Light is bad. It accelerates chemical reactions for sure. It's why bottles are green or brown in beer. You see that Cristal overwrap that is not decorative. They have a clear bottle. And so if they didn't have that overwrap, which is a UV absorbing overwrap, their wine goes bad. So if you're ever buying Cristal from a store, if you find yourself in that situation, hopefully they didn't remove that. And if they did, look elsewhere, because the UV light can be very damaging. One of the things that's really changed, which is great, is that lighting is LED, and you can get LED lighting that is UV free. So good cellars should have non-UV lighting in them. And that's why the lights in wine fridges, when they have them, are LEDs as well. I love this. This is a test to see whether it makes a difference if you store a wine horizontally or vertically. So gotta love the French. The Germans did it too. So what you're seeing here are different closures. So the control was sealed, I think, with epoxy. And then they had various types of corks, first grade being this sort of magenta color, plastic corks of a variety of different kinds. And anyway, they stored them either horizontally or vertically. The left axis is the oxygen uptake or intake. And what's interesting is they plateau, which I was trying to understand. At least everything clearly Noma cork was a bad call, as was Supreme cork from an oxidation standpoint, stored either vertically or horizontally. But everybody else seems to plateau, which was interesting. It's an initial uptake of oxygen, and it drops. Basically what I see in this is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't seem to matter whether you store it vertically or horizontally. We at Coravin have found that that is not true. Coravin bottles do better when stored on their side. So I'm a fan of storing on their side. You pick up the differences at around 5 years. So turns out you can store your wines either upright or on their side. It's your call. I thought it was going to be different, but it's not. How it's served. This is my territory. There are a lot of different times when oxygen gets into a bottle. There's opening it, screw cap or cork. A very tiny amount of oxygen gets in, and the reason why only a little amount gets in is because the gases normally in the head space of a closed bottle are heavier than air. Normally the bottle is sparged with argon or nitrogen when it's being filled. So those are heavy. Nitrogen's not, but argon is. And then there's not much space in the headspace, so not all that much gets in. Air really gets in during the pouring process. When you tip it sideways, glug, 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 as the wine comes out, air is getting in. So that is probably the biggest ingress of oxygen. And then after it's closed, this is actually something we discovered ourselves. It really matters what you reclose it with. Turns out silicon rubber is bad. So if you Google search most permeable polymer to oxygen, you will find silicon rubber. So it looks closed and wine doesn't leak out, but oxygen's getting in like it's an open window. So turns out silicon's not good. I mean, it's great to clean and it looks nice. It's rubbery, but it doesn't actually prevent oxygen from getting in. And you can see it here in this little chart. And so we at Coravin do not use silicon in any of our things, in particular our pivot stopper or our champagne stopper. We use a medical grade material that is impermeable to oxygen, also elastic. So another benefit of being from the medical world. So how have people tried to handle this? Reformatting, that's a good one. You did get the exposure to oxygen during the pouring process and the opening process, but if you repour it and fill the bottle, at least there's no oxygen left. And so lots of people keep bottles, either small 375s or keep water bottles. It's a great way to use them for recycling. The other one is to try to push the air out after pouring. I like this product from the UK. Unfortunately, they're using silicon rubber. I wish they weren't. But it's beautiful and it looks closed. And so it's trying to decrease the interaction between oxygen and the headspace. This is something extremely cool. So if you are familiar with beef jerky, there's this little white packet in the beef jerky filled with something. And that's not there to keep it dry. That's actually an oxygen absorber. It is an aggressive oxygen absorber, sort of like sulfur is in wine. This is even more powerful and kept in a pack. So these guys at a company called Repour came up with an idea of a disposable stopper where you would peel the bottom off and expose this aggressive oxygen scavenger and stick it into the neck of a bottle. And I got to tell you, it sucks all the oxygen out of that bottle. It does a pretty effective job at preserving wine for a couple of weeks, for sure. So certainly better than vacuum vent. Which, they try to create a vacuum and suck the air out. You can't create a perfect vacuum, and vacuums always want to rebalance. And so they'll try to pull oxygen in, and they're using silicon rubber, which lets oxygen in anyway. So anyway, Repour is the best thing that I've found from a stopper standpoint. Kind of a cool idea. The only problem is you're throwing them away every time, which I hate trash. There's replacing the oxygen after pouring, spray cans of argon. Argon is heavier than air. It sort of works. We've tested it. It takes a lot of argon to truly displace the air on the inside of the bottle, but it does make you feel better, and I like the people a lot. There's the idea of pouring with an inert gas, which was probably first commercialized by Enomatic in Europe. And so the bottle's open, the thing is put in, and then you can pump the wine out using an inert gas. which is a very good idea. I checked out what gases they were using when I started Coravin, because it's kind of a cool idea. It's more challenging to use at home, and it's certainly hard for a distributor or importer to carry it around, but it's you see them in restaurants still because they're effective. We do something similar. It's kind of an enomatic in your hand. It's a new device we've got called Pivot, which doesn't use a needle. It uses a tube, so it pours really fast and doesn't use much gas to pour. And we use a stopper that does not use silicon rubber, uses that medical grade material. And the wine will last a month because you're preventing oxygen from getting in after you use it, and you're displacing the wine using argon when you're pouring. So we found really good results with that, at least up to a month, if not longer. I came up with the idea of Coravin when I was, oh, good Lord, 30. 30 exactly. My wife at the time was pregnant with our second son and had stopped drinking. We never agreed on wine anyway. She always wanted Nebbiolo. I love Nebbiolo, but I don't want to drink it every day. I like white wine. And so I wanted to be able to taste 3 or 4 different wines in an evening. I wanted to learn faster and compare. And there was nothing out there that would let me do that at home. And so I came up with this. This is the very, very first prototype of Coravin, 1999. At the time, it was called Wine Mosquito, because my 3-year-old son at the time named it, and it sort of stuck. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is the very first medical product I developed. It's called the Protective Peripheral IV Catheter, sold by Johnson & Johnson. And it used a needle. My second device was a chemotherapy delivery system. So it was an implant that went underneath the skin, and a tube went into your heart where there was high flow to dilute the chemotherapy. And then you would access this implant underneath your skin with a needle over and over again during the course of somebody's therapy. So I got really good at making needles that didn't do damage to things. And I remember sitting in my kitchen with a bottle in my hand and a needle going, there's got to be a way I can get wine out. And so the first prototype is there. That night I drank 5 different wines. I actually have the second prototype right here, and I'll show it to you in just a sec. But it changed my life. Now I can drink. I have a couple hundred different wines in my cellar. I can drink any of them in any quantity, any night, and come back to them whenever I want. So we don't open. We pour using an inert gas, and we don't have to close. The cork does that on its own. It's elastic. So I'm a nerd. I run randomized clinical trials in my medical device world. And so we decided to run a randomized clinical trial in wine with wine professionals all across the planet. So we enlisted 644 to date, wine professionals, masters of wine in London, sommeliers in London, Paris, Shanghai, New York, San Francisco, Sydney and Perth. So all over the world, Burgundy and Bordeaux wine producers, also in Napa, to taste their own wines. And we set up tests where we would Coravin half of the case and leave the other half of the case. And then we would blind taste those accessed wines against a control bottle from the same case at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Sorry, it's a Friday here out on St. Patrick's Day in Boston, so my group is here, and out to 4 years. And so you can see the results here. We used a 5-glass test. The random chance of guessing is about 4 or 5%. And so you can see that the correct guessing so in the 5-glass test, 1 glass could be Coravin from the Coravin bottle, up to 4 glasses. You don't know which one. And so the random chance is around 4 or 5%. And you can see the random guessing is clustered around 4 or 5%. The wines were oxidized. They were all servable, and there was nothing outside of bottle-to-bottle variability. So it's been reaffirming to show that the factors affecting the pouring of wine that are controlled by Coravin can really result in some long-term storage. This was Chateau Latour. They did full chemical analysis. They didn't believe my tasting analysis, and so they were like, okay, we'll do this 6-bottle test. We'll Coravin 1 bottle at each of 5 months, and then we'll pour it into our FOSS machine, and then we'll test 1 new control bottle every month. And we'll see whether or not any of the factors vary in that multiply Coravin bottle versus the control bottle or outside of bottle-to-bottle variability. And they found out no. It was a very short and curt meeting, a gruff meeting at the first time that I met them, and then they invited me back and we drank for 3 or 4 hours the second time. So it was a good result. That's Dorian Faget, who I've got a wine crush on because I think Chateau Latour is marvelous. And then sparkling is an interesting one. Preserving sparkling wine. The silver spoon does not work. Don't believe it. And so I'm going to go back one. There are 2 problems with sparkling wine. It can oxidize and it can go flat. And so I wanted to be able to have a different glass of sparkling wine every night of the week. And so how do we get there? So I spent 4 years trying to put a needle through the cork underneath the muesli, under the cap and at an angle, and I've got patents on this, and I got it to finally work, but wine going through a needle with gas in it, and then it going out the other side, it expands and it foams and goes flat, so I could make still wine from sparkling. It was a very frustrating reality, so I did all sorts of things, but in the end, the only way it worked is if you had an octopus with a PhD to get it to function. And so one of my engineers here said, isn't CO2 heavier than oxygen? Isn't the wine producing CO2 in the bottle when you're pouring it into the glass? Isn't it foaming? So isn't the problem of the pour not as big of a problem? The ingress of oxygen during the pour is not as big of a problem. Can't we just close the bottle and then restore the perlage? And won't that work? And so he was right, I was wrong. So we spent 4 more years solving that problem because we tried to make a stopper that fit on every single bottle. Looks large, but only adds a centimeter to the top of the bottle. And uses that special material that we developed during Pivot to seal against oxygen. And it fits on any bottle from a half bottle to a magnum, except for the rare few. We don't fit on a magnum of Bilcar Salmon, sadly, because what a wonderful bottle to drink. But what are you going to do? I'm trying to make one for them. I'm trying to make it universal. And then we restore the perlage using a simple charger. We've gotten very good at pressure sensing and control, and so we've created one that has a little red light, green light. When you press it down on the bottle, it's red, and then it gets to green. You've got the right perlage. And we tested this with LVMH. So Dom Perignon, Krug, Ruinart, Veuve Clicquot, and Chandon. During the pandemic, had to do something when you were locked up. So we were all drinking champagne. I tested on 250 different sparkling wines from around the world. And we became the official wine preservation partner for Moet Hennessy as a result of their testing outcome. So we've done blind tastings out to 3 months very consistently. 1 month for sure, 3 months definitely. And I was in London and sommelier at, I think it's 1852. So the name of the restaurant is A Year, and a Gordon Ramsay restaurant. And the sommelier came up to me and he poured me a glass from a Coravin sparkling preserved bottle. And he goes, "How long do you think this has been open?" I was like, "I don't know, a month?" And he goes, "9 months. You're lying to us. It lasts longer." I was like, "Okay, fine. 9 months. You should be selling that wine." So these are our claims now: 4 weeks with Pivot, a month, or month with Pivot, a month with sparkling, and then years with Coravin, Timeless, the original. And so I think that gives me a chance to show you some things. Clean, clear, and cellar. This is how you get the best results with Coravin. There's a little bit of wine left in the inside of the valve and the needle with Coravin after you've used it. So don't let Brettanomyces or Saccharomyces grow out on the inside of your Coravin. Run some hot water through its spout. It cleans out the needle in the valve. If you've never done this and you've used your Coravin a bunch, pour some vodka down your spout. Inexpensive vodka you don't care about. I'll explain clearing in just a sec when I use Coravin, and then cellaring. I like keeping it cold, keeping it outside. Obviously, no light, no vibration. That'll lead to the best results. So that is my quick tour of the science of wine preservation. I have some stuff here with me. This is Wine Mosquito 2. Looks like a weapon, right? But it had everything, almost everything that was necessary for Coravin. It's got a capsule of gas, inert gas, has a non-coring needle. This is actually the medical needle. has a little valve here, and it has a regulator that controls the pressure that goes into the bottle. So this is essentially the guts of what Coravin has become. So the function was here, except for the clamping to the bottle, but it was much, much harder to use and not safe to have around kids. So we have come a long way since the beginning. And then I've got, I have one of my original test bottles. This is Pusino Macul, which is a, I think a Bordeaux blend, Chilean from Maipo Valley, 2001. I think it cost me all of $10, maybe a little bit less back then, but it was part of my testing from the original moments. This was accessed first in 2004, December 29th, 2004, with what is now our vintage needle. And I used argon gas on this one. I was testing argon, and carbon dioxide, and nitrogen as different, and helium, which was fun. My kids breathed it all. It didn't work, but it was fun. And so I have not Coravin this bottle since almost 20 years. I was going to Coravin this. It is our 10th anniversary at Coravin. We've been on the market for 10 years. Started in the United States and spread across the world. So cleaning, I washed this yesterday. Wash it any evening if you've used Coravin. Clearing is quickly pressing the trigger before you go into the next bottle. And that way, if you're moving from bottle to bottle, you eject any wine that might be in the needle so you don't push it into the next bottle. You also fill the needle with argon so that what's going into the bottle first is argon gas, which that makes a difference. So I cleared it, pressed the needle through, tip it sideways, see this, press and pour. I can smell the wine from here. I'm hopeful. It wasn't meant for 20 years. I didn't design Coravin for 20 years. My mark was 5. I was happy with 5. So that is that. Here is the wine. It's not oxidized. Oh, it smells great. Yeah. So I get nervous and I'm kind of shocked. Didn't make it for 20 years, but that's the miracle of the cork. I love wine. So that is Coravin, and that's my sort of science of wine preservation. I'm deeply engrossed in science, as we are here. Everything we do is science driven. We measure OTR and have our own FOSS machine. We measure sulfur dioxide and everything that we do. It's remarkable the things that we've learned. We're about to launch something new for the wine industry, and I think it combines everything we've done before, and it's been fascinating, all the learnings along the way, and the impacts of oxygen. And yeah, I'm amazed the cork did a good job too, right? Right, that wine was not intended for 20 years. So everyone's told me. But so when I was 30 years old, I was young and poor. I just left my company and was moving up to Boston to start my own businesses. And so really had nothing in terms of cash. And so when I wanted to test this thing, I was buying $10 wine. So I've got a whole lot of $10 Spanish, Australian, and South American wines that are out 20 years that I'm going to inflict upon people across the planet to have to taste. Happy to take questions.
There is. Thank you very much, Greg. I think to giving us the benefit of your research over many years that you've done in the last 20 years or so. And there is Trevor Sherrott has got a few comments he's would like to make. So Trevor, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Greg. Really interesting. I do have your product here.
The original.
Yeah, and I have I'm in Singapore. I have a newer one in London. Some comments and some questions, although they're quite short. First, to say that I have a particular use of the Coravin when I go to, not here in Singapore, when I go to not portfolio tastings, but like bin end sales by distributors, I take it with me. Like on a Saturday morning, and they might have 4 bottles of a Chenin or something, and I'll try one and I'll pay for it to see whether I like it. And I'll buy the rest if I do. I don't use it much else. What I tend to use for storing wine, which you didn't mention, is these plastic pouches called platicus.
Oh, yeah.
And I've just raided my fridge, so I've got some port and white and red and stuff, and you just squeeze the air out each time you reseal it. I think they're brilliant. I've never detected any taint or anything, and they're very, very cheap. I have a question. The gas that you use, and I also have one of these things which I don't really use, doesn't matter what the brand is. I always had a suspicion that they use nitrogen to a greater proportion, less argon, because of the price difference. So nitrogen's not really inert. Can you comment on that, and what do you use?
Yes. So we use argon. We use medical grade argon that we source from Germany, and that is capsuled in Austria. This all matters, by the way. So you're right, nitrogen blended with argon, you see 80-20 blends, 80% nitrogen, 20% argon. It has 2 effects. One is nitrogen is not entirely inert. It has very few chemical reactions at normal temperatures. But the bigger problem with nitrogen is that it dissolves in a fluid. So Guinness beer is nitrogenated. Those tiny bubbles in Guinness are actually nitrogen bubbles. And the advantage of the totally inert gases like argon, xenon, helium, is that they do not dissolve in a fluid. Or if they do, they're out immediately as soon as the pressure is taken off. So you don't, I found that nitrogen added a flattening, it sort of flattened and dulled the wine. We were stuck selling nitrogen in Japan because they didn't have argon approved as a food contact material for a long time. It was frustrating. The other problem is you can't get as much nitrogen into a capsule as you can argon. And so just because of the molarity of the gas, we were able to get more argon into the capsule. Turns out the majority of the cost of a capsule of gas is the container. It's a steel container holding a 2,800 pounds per square inch. So that metal is important, and it's recyclable. So it's really important to recycle your capsules because that metal is valuable. In your story, one of the validation tests of Coravin, very quickly, was when I was developing prototypes, I told a local wine store, I'm going to go into the store and steal a glass of wine, and you're not going to know. It needs to be so easy to use that I can walk into your store and steal a glass of wine. And I promised to tell you, and I promised to buy the wine. And I achieved that goal at Marty's Newton here in Massachusetts. Friends with Marty, and I do the same thing. I would go to the store, buy a bottle of wine, bring it across the line from the cashier, Coravin it, taste it, decide whether or not I liked it, go back and buy more. So I'm a big believer in that strategy. I think tasting is the only advantage that physical retail has over the internet, the ability to taste the wine on location. And I hope that they move in that direction and become tasting houses, right, for purchasers, because I think that's their last remaining advantage.
So just to clarify, what is the mix of gases in the Coravin?
100% argon. It's 99.999997.
Sure.
Pure argon. And argon is the first noble gas heavier than oxygen. And it's 1% of the air we're breathing. So the way they make it is they freeze the air liquide. They freeze the air, and the stuff that's not frozen at the top is argon and hydrogen and helium. But argon's 1%, so that's the majority of the gas at the top.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Greg. There's one question here from Ellen Wallace. Ellen, do you want to ask Greg your question?
I see it as well.
Okay, no. Can you see the question, Greg?
I see it. The one concern, cost of Coravin.
I have a hand on a cast, so I'm having trouble using the mouse to unmute myself. So you can hear me now, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm slow. Yeah, I actually, Greg, I sat next to you in Montreux in 2014. Yeah. This was like, what is this crazy idea this guy has? And so it's really quite exciting to see what's happened since then. And of course, loads of people I know in the wine business now have your products, and that's great. But one thing I hear from people in wineries who do use it is they sort of say, well, it is a little bit expensive, you know, or individuals who like fine wines, but they're not in that really top category of earners and so on. So basically, I'm just curious about the history and looking forward, price-wise, pricing. What would you say?
Yeah. I met the manufacturer of our capsules in a bar in Slovenia before the product was launched. And we started off charging us a lot because he's like, I've seen a lot of wine companies fail, wine product companies fail, and they burned me. So we went from a retail price in the US of $10 down to $9, down to $8, down to $7, and now we're at $5 a capsule because we order them in the millions at this point. And so we pass that savings on to the customer. So you should be able to get 15 glasses of wine out of every capsule, at least. I can get more. I can get into the 20s. I'm going to demonstrate to you how by pouring this other bottle. Somebody had asked, does the fill level matter? Well, we're about to find out. This is a bottle that was poured 12 years or 11 years ago, June of 12. It's punctured a bunch of times. Back then, it looks like there's 4 different tastings on the front that I wrote. It's a 2005 Bordeaux. So there is an efficient way of using Coravin. That's a good sound. It's a positive gas pressure on the inside. That means the cork did its job. So multiple short presses on the trigger, like this, is much more efficient than one long press. So a couple of short presses until you get the flow rate you like. Stop just by tipping up. You want to minimize that sound at the end. The problem is when you hold the trigger down for a long time, a lot of gas goes in. You stop pouring when there's still a lot of gas inside, and then you'll hear this big, and that's wasted argon gas. Could have poured wine. So multiple short presses on the trigger is the way to go. So you get the flow rate you like. And it's like driving your car. The faster you drive, the more gas you burn. So in restaurants, we gave them a fast flow needle so that they could pour using less pressure. The other way of pouring more efficiently is the pivot. The pivot uses this big tube to pour instead of a needle. And so the resistance to flow is near 0. So we can use less pressure to pour the same wine. So the capsules last at least 20 glasses. And I've gotten them up to 25. So when you start doing the math, like $5 in the US, the cost per glass comes down to 20 cents. So if the wine has to be worth saving for 20 cents per glass. Yeah, it's nice. 2005 Bordeaux is a good year.
Winnie, did you want to ask your question or?
Yeah. Hi, Greg. I'm from South Africa, and I just wanted to say I'm very sorry not to be able to claim you because Lambrecht is actually a very common South African surname. So imagine my disappointment.
German and Austrian, sorry.
I just want to know if you've used the Coravin into a bottle that is already corked. When you pour it and you taste it and it's corked, is there a special way of cleaning the needle in order not to transfer that to the next bottle, or what do you suggest doing?
So actually we tested this incidentally. We were in Napa and we were Coravin across 6 bottles to store for this case test. We were at Donna Estates and pushed our needle through the first one, poured out a glass, went to the second one, poured out a glass, went across, and it turns out that first bottle was heavily corked. And so we had gone between bottles just using our quick press technique in between each bottle. And we did not transfer cork taint from one to the other. So that's very good news. We thought we would, we didn't. And that's because TCA is not alive. Trichloroanisole is just an unfortunate chemical compound that doesn't multiply. It ruins many an evening for me, especially if you've stored the wine for a long time. So there's no risk of cork taint. There is risk of transfer of Brettanomyces. So Brett and Saccharomyces, so Acetobacter, these are all nasties that can survive in wine, multiply and wreck the stuff. And so we found out from a distributor in New York very early on when his portfolio had a lot of Chateauneuf and a lot of white Burgundy. And so he was going back and forth between and transferring Brett from Chateauneuf to white Burgundy. And I got to tell you, Brett on white Burgundy is terrible. It's really bad. And so that's why I say wash it at the end of the evening. Hot water through the spout, and anything that is Coravin, hot water through here. Even Coravin Sparkling, our stopper, I rinse it, pour water into here, and give it a shake afterwards. That's all you need to do.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Greg. There's a few more questions that have come through. Angela, did you want to ask your question quickly to Greg? There's a few more below as well, so we'll try and get through them. Angela was asking whether it makes a difference between one pour or more on the same occasion and how long the wine remains fresh.
Yeah. So there are a couple of ways of using it on the same occasion. So I have a Magnum at my house that I do plan to bring out, that I Coravin at a trade show held by Marc Perrin, or the Beaucastel family. We were in Paris, and I was showing off a Magnum, or it was a double Magnum of 2006 Chateauneuf, and I Coravined it each time to demonstrate Coravin. I Coravined it about 28 to 30 times over the course of a day, and it's down to probably the last 3 glasses, 2 to 3 glasses in the bottle. And that was back in 2014. I tasted it again just last week, and it was great. So I don't believe the number of accesses matters. The cork quality matters. So if it's really bad cork, we're not going to be successful. And so test on cork, just to get a sense of how your cork is. It's not perfect as a test, but it's a good one. Charles Curtis, as a master of wine, said, before I use Coravin, I take my hand, I wrap it around the neck, put my thumb on top and push down. If the cork slides, I don't use Coravin. And I drink it as fast as I can because it's failing in its elasticity. So as long as the cork is elastic and it's holding solidly, the multiple strikes are totally okay. The other...
Sorry, can I just ask the rest of my question, Andrea?
Sure.
If you've taken several pours from the bottle, does the argon replace all the space?
Yes, and I'm going to use it. I'll use that as an excuse to pour myself this Burgundy from 2015. So what is in this bottle? It's, I don't know, there's a couple of glasses left. The bottle, when it's full, you pass the Coravin into it, like so. When I press this, so no air is going in, no wine's coming out, because the needle is small and there's argon in here. When I press the trigger, argon goes into the bottle, and this bottle is transparent enough where you're going to be able to see it bubble, I hope. If I press the trigger, argon goes in, and that argon pressure is pushing the wine out of the bottle into your glass. So no air is going in to displace the wine. It's just the argon pressure pushing.
Okay.
And so when I tip up, you hear that sound, that's the extra argon coming out. And you can see I can see that it's bubbling a little bit. And that's extra argon pushing its way out. Then I remove the needle. So no air got in while I was pouring, only argon went in. And so there is no air in the headspace whatsoever. It doesn't let any air in. So that's the key to it working.
So sorry, Greg, can I just chip in here? So the argon that was in the bottle remains there. It's just replaced with more argon, replacing the wine that you just poured.
That's right.
So it's not a brand new set of argon for every pour.
You get a blend of the old and the new, because when you vent, some of the old and some of the new comes out at the end. Somebody asked the question, what it's almost implying what are the hardest wines, and they're right, older whites and Burgundy are the most challenging to preserve. Oh, this is Maggie. Hello, Maggie. I miss Maggie. So older whites and Burgundy, and it's a couple of different things. Lower sulfur wines are at the most risk for acceleration with Coravin. So natural wines, older wines, where oxygen has already gotten in and eaten up most of the sulfur dioxide. Burgundy, although white Burgundies, I got to tell you, they're dosing them with so much sulfur nowadays. Those are less risk. But what matters with older wines and Burgundies, very importantly, is the quality of the cork. So older white wines implies an older cork, as well as technique. So there is no time when technique is more important than older wines. So that whole thing about washing and a quick press on the trigger before you go to the next bottle, absolutely critical when accessing Burgundy or older wines. I really recommend doing that every time. Quick press on the trigger, access, or take it out, and then at the end of the evening, wash it. You'll get the best outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. I think that's gone through most of the questions there. Heather, who had one query, she's had to drop off for now. So all we can say is thank you very much, and I'll hand